Hi, my name is Grant Oliphant, and I am a writer, podcaster, and CEO of the Conrad Prebys Foundation in San Diego, California. Welcome to The Written Scene.
Hello and welcome to The Written Scene. My name is Adam Greenfield. I am the host, and this is episode 80. It's bananas to me that we are in this would be the fourth year of doing this podcast early on. And I'm really enjoying it. We've had some great conversations, very interesting topics. I've learned a lot, and I've also realized that I knew a lot too, and that was great. That was it's a fun realization. But today's guest is someone that I recently met. Well, recently, maybe a year and a half ago, and I help with their podcast Stop and Talk with the Conrad Prebys Foundation. One of my favorite podcasts, and not just because I work on it, but I really love the conversations there. So today we have the host of that podcast and the CEO of the Conrad Prebys Foundation. So Grant, thank you for being here.
Adam, it really is a delight.
I'm glad we could do this. Yeah. When we first met, I didn't know you had written books, and then I was like, well, now I have to have them on my podcast. So yeah. I'm glad we got to do this. So to start, I know as the CEO of Conrad Prebys Foundation and other things, your schedule's pretty booked. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I also know that lately you and I have talked about how you've been really itching to get back to writing.
Right.
How's that going?
It's happening.
Okay.
It is happening.
That's good.
And I think I spoke about this recently at a creative morning session, but I'm finding new and more ways to integrate writing into my days and into the flow of my work and how I think about all of the issues that I'm working on.
Yeah. What are you doing to do that?
Well, I have to tell a story if I can. Yeah, if I can.
I mean, we are storytellers.
And I have told you this story once when you asked me to come do a reading for one of your poetry reading sessions. Mm-hmm. I did write two novels in my 30s, and I did it the classic way of staying up late at night after my kids had fallen asleep and just muscling through till morning. And, mm-hmm. and I had a terrific experience with the first one where it was bought by a major publishing house, and then they crushed my spirit by not actually publishing it because they started downsizing the publishing list, and it was a whole thing, and in many ways the disappointment of what felt like the fulfillment of a life stream. Mm-hmm. And it took me a couple of years to get back into it and convince myself, no, I should try again. And I muscled my way through writing another novel, Ring of Years, which is the one that's out there in the public domain now. And I had a very similar experience where I had an agent in New York who loved the book, and then 30 some odd rejections later declared that she couldn't sell it anywhere. And I over-internalized that. Mm-hmm. So I, at that point, had a conversation with myself where I said, I have to concentrate on my day job and stop this silly fantasy about being a writer. And so I bifurcated myself at that moment. And I have lived with it ever since. Actually, meeting you and beginning to talk to you about how you viewed writing and poetry helped me on the journey of reintegrating these aspects of myself. Cool. So what do I do about it? I think a lot about poetry when I'm journaling in the morning, and mm-hmm. I write some things when I am journaling that are just stream of consciousness around what's on my mind.
Right.
And I integrate more and more writing into my approach to my job, and I am feeling much more like these parts of me are coming back together.
Good. Good. Sometimes you got to throw in something whenever you can,
Right.
and that just keeps you afloat just
It
to the
does.
next day or
Yeah.
next moment you get to be able to write. And with the multiple jobs I have, I do the same thing. I
Yeah.
just squeeze it in when I can. And I don't want to get you in trouble with any board members, but I'm curious, are there times where you're in a meeting or you're in the office and you're like, I just want to be writing, like I don't want to be here?
Well, sure. I've had that. I've had that feeling. I would say I get to do a rare kind of work that gives me enormous satisfaction.
Okay,
So,
good.
I don't have the sort of meetings you read about in fiction where you're sitting and trying to debate the color of the paper clips. It is the conversations we're having are about how to help people, how to change a region, it's pretty extraordinary. So that's a gift, and I don't take any moment of it lightly. But sure, there are moments where I suddenly get an idea, or I feel some deep feeling that makes me wish I could be off writing that. And I think all of us who have any creative passion have moments where you feel like the tug of doing that instead of what you're doing in the moment. What I'm getting way better at is, instead of deciding that I'm doing the wrong thing or living the wrong life, I know I'm not.
Yeah.
Instead of succumbing to that, what I realize is, and I will focus on getting to that sequentially as my day allows, or my month allows, or my year allows.
Are you pretty strict about scheduling things, or do you, and sticking to it if you can, or is it something where you say, oh, I actually have a moment, I'm going to sneak that in?
It's more the latter. I'm actually terrible at scheduling it and sticking to it. And I would say, if I had any bit of advice for myself, which I do periodically,
hopefully good
all
advice
the time, it is to schedule more time for writing. Also, to be kind with myself about that, because I think this is something that I really, that phrase of "don't should on yourself." Mm-hmm. Well, I used to do that a lot, and what I would end up feeling was miserable because I couldn't keep the schedule, and I would decide I was not only a bad writer, but a bad person, and that I didn't deserve to have the dreams that I do. That's a really bad way to go about it. So I am much easier with myself now, just to do what I can when I can.
Yeah, I had to learn, probably in a similar hard way, to say I will try again tomorrow. Like I couldn't have gotten to it today, or I was just lazy today, but there's always tomorrow.
Right. That's right.
It can be a struggle to get there, but it's really important to get there, because I've told you and others that some of the work I do is just not fulfilling at all.
Right.
But when I do have work that is fulfilling, like working on Stop and Talk and other things, and the poetry readings and everything, that's a worthy sacrifice, quote unquote sacrifice, of time away from writing. Because they fulfill you, they fulfill me. Getting that feeling is important, especially as a writer when you're just sitting in front of a desk.
Right.
You're like, does this matter? So
it is. It is a very isolating and lonely journey.
Yeah.
To be a writer.
Yeah, it can be.
So fulfilling yourself with those other activities is also important.
It is. It is. Mm-hmm. So what were the two books you wrote? What talk a little about what's the kind of stuff you do, right?
Well, yeah, what I'm working on now is different from what I did then.
Okay.
But what I wrote then was the first one, which was bought by Crown Division of Random House and then never published, was a book called Web Walkers, and it was a thriller set on what was then the very beginning of the internet.
Oh, yeah. I was wondering if it was about spiders or the internet.
Yeah, and it was about the internet, and I was. This is back before the World Wide Web was a thing, and it was sort of just in its infancy. And I started playing with this idea of a world in which a different type of psychology emerged online than we saw in our day-to-day lives. And it was, looking back, it was amazingly prophetic.
Yeah, I was going to say.
It was also imperfect. I think I when I reflect on it now, when the publishing house returned the rights to me after they decided that they weren't going to publish it, I could have rewritten it, but two things happened. One was I was crushed and,
Sure.
Emotionally just, I did not react well to that. The second thing was I realized, this is going to take major work because that world had moved so quickly that the premise no longer felt fresh to me.
Interesting.
And I couldn't quite figure. So was it my perfectionism that caused me not to rewrite it and try it again, or was it just that its time had passed? I don't know. But that's, so that was one experience.
Okay.
The second book, which I did eventually make available online, is a book called Ring of Years. It's and it was also a thriller, and I was playing there with the idea of cults and being what it would be like to have been raised in a cult, escaped it, and then been pulled back in by dint of circumstances where someone else's life depended on you revisiting this terrible past. And when I reread it years and years later, I thought, oh man, this is dark.
Yeah.
So I clearly was also exercising some demons.
I was going to ask what inspired these books.
Yeah. Well, I just had so much fun writing them.
Okay.
The day-to-day of writing, as you know, is kind of painful, and there's a bit of an ordeal of forcing yourself to sit down at the word processor or whatever. But when you get into the flow and you start identifying with your characters and
just magic,
and the story takes over, it is kind of magic.
Yeah.
It's a drug unlike any other. So I don't know. I just
involved in the story.
I just got involved in the story, and
Okay.
I kept asking myself, well, okay, where's this going?
Right.
Then when I had that break with my self as a writer, I set that aside. Now what I'm actively working on is a nonfiction book that explores metaphors that have helped save my life. That have been very important to me from literature and poetry, because I actually think we underuse this idea of metaphor, we misuse this idea of metaphor. And or we decide metaphors mean one thing when they can be so incredibly rich in terms of what they represent to each of us as individuals, let alone in the collective psyche. So, yeah, I'm having fun with that.
Sounds like an interesting book.
Yeah.
It's probably pretty introspective.
Well, as you and I have talked about in other places, it is an opportunity for me to share some stories from my life.
Sure.
I go back and forth on, okay, is this a memoir or is this a story about language and writing and creativity? And it's
Maybe
a little bit of both.
Yeah. I think when you're there's a few books I feel like that kind of have to give me that feel that I've read in the past where it's enough of the personal story and enough of something to go, oh, I can connect with that.
Right.
Right. Those sorts of books, I think they're pretty great. I like those books, so I'm looking forward to reading it when you're done.
Thank
As
you.
I'm sure you are as well.
No pressure.
No pressure or anything. Finish that book.
Thank you.
So as a kid, I mean, what were you reading? And actually also, did you have any like particular parents or teachers or siblings that kind of inspired you or pushed you towards a certain type of reading?
Well, I was a prolific reader when I was a kid, and it was what I loved to do in my spare time best. And I read, detective fiction and every Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes story I could find, and science fiction I read extensively. There wasn't a big portfolio in those days that I identified with in the fantasy genre, but I was big into science fiction. I was a total Tolkien geek,
Mm-hmm.
and everything that sprang off of that. I loved almost all of the classics in children's literature, and as I was a kid growing up, I started getting into deeper and deeper into books that led in odd directions, like The Phantom Tollbooth and Wind in the Willows, of course.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
but
I forgot about that book.
Yeah, well, there are just so many. There's so many good books.
Yeah.
And I, what I have found is I do a lot of reading now for work, and a lot of that is nonfiction because it's about issues and things that are happening in our culture that I want to or need to know about. But I'm still really drawn in my reading to books that open up magical worlds, or the idea of us having a type of agency we don't understand or know that we have.
Yeah.
I loved the school of magical realism and 100 Years of Solitude, and things that gave us a different way of understanding very serious issues and reality, but made it somehow seem magical at the same time. And that is kind of my sense of life.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
There's something about those books that are part life, part real life, and part almost real life.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I also love that sort of thing. There's this book I read called The Cat That Saved a Bookstore or something like this, and I think it was a Japanese writer, and it was the weirdest book, and it was perfect because you could kind of see some of it happening, and there's some of it where you're like, what? Yeah, exactly. But I love that sort of thing. I mean, even in my newsletter, I wrote about how I love Japanese authors. I'm reading this book, Days at the Murasaki Bookshop, and it's just so plain. It's not.
I've heard that's good.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's different, but it's this. It's just a day in the life. There's nothing really too in depth about it. But I love that sort of Raymond Carver-esque, like I'm just through the eyes of the character,
right? Here's the story.
Here's the story, exactly. Yeah. So, have you held any jobs where storytelling was just not part of any of it?
Yeah, and I hated them.
Yeah.
I've held those, and I had a job where storytelling was part of it because I was in marketing and communications. Yeah. And it was in service of something I just didn't believe in. And I got very quickly that I couldn't do. To a big part of the way I've approached every single job I've had is as a task or as an opportunity to tell a higher order story.
Yeah.
And when that has felt like it's in service of something that is just not aligned with me or what I care about, then I've suffered.
Yeah.
Other times I've had it where it hasn't been felt like the highest and best use, but it's felt fine because it's at least interesting work that has been aligned with what I'm curious about.
And I think that's important. When you write, do you also try to make sure that what you write has some kind of impact in that sense, or do you write to just tell a day at the Murasaki Bookshop?
Yeah. I think I shared a story with you recently about when I was in ninth grade and newly in Washington, D.C. and not really wanting to be there. And I had a poetry assignment. The visiting teacher who was reviewing our poetry sort of dismissed mine as wanting to say too much,
mm-hmm.
which hurt me really badly.
I get it. Been there. Yeah.
And what teenager doesn't want to say too much? I think I am not great at fiction that just recounts what's going on, or storytelling that's just about what's going on. I am drawn to trying to deduce lessons from that, or insights, or wisdom, or whatever you want to call it, and hopefully not moralizing. So I think I'm more inclined towards. I think that's part of why the why the interest in magic in life in general is there's something there that I want to grasp and that I want to help other people grasp.
I always tell people I have more fun ruining someone else's life. That's why I write fiction.
That's great.
It's just
I love that.
That's just
I
how
love that.
I just let me screw up that person's life, and then I can fix it.
Yeah,
I'll be
right.
fine because I'm the author. I'll figure it out.
That's right. Or not. You may not.
Who knows? Who knows? Maybe they don't grow as a character. But that's the poem that you wrote. You're 14.
Yeah.
All right. I was going to ask this because you mentioned this at the Creative Mornings talk, and I was going to ask the question, but things were running late, ran out of time, so I didn't get to. But I want to know, had you had someone who said, you're saying too much, but we can work on it to say what you really want to say and have that impact, would that changed how you write?
I think it would have utterly changed the experience. And I think how we talk to people about writing is important. And it was when I look back, it was factually correct that I was trying to do too much. I was a 14-year-old kid, mad about the world, mad about this move and what was going on with my family, and really especially mad about what I saw happening with the environment back then. And so I had things to say, and I put too much into the poem, and I burdened the poem. But I wish that the critique had been exactly what you described, which is subtlety is important in storytelling, and nuance is important in storytelling, and not hitting people over the head with a hammer is important in storytelling.
As much as you may want to.
Right. All of these are good lessons for writing. But if she had then said, but let's work on that because you can get there, I would have felt completely differently enabled than I did.
Do you think that that's happening now? That sort of thing with 14-year-olds that are writing too big of a poem?
I don't know, because I'm not that close to that level of instruction anymore. But I do know that the poetry that rises to the top, when you look at the poets who we celebrate and who we listen to, most of them have a degree of subtlety that is, they can still get a lot into a poem, but they know how not to put in too much, and again, how not to beat people over the head with their meaning. I sort of marveled at Ada Lamone's poetry, which I really came to study a couple of years ago. And, there's this wonderful poem that she has about a girl being Superwoman. And it is a marvelously subtle poem, even while it uses really big, obvious images that you could say, oh, well, it's obvious what that's trying to say, but it's actually not. So I think to the extent that we're still celebrating poetry that achieves that level of mastery, then I would say no, but I don't.
It's
really
hard to
know.
say. Yeah. I saw Ada Limon. I have her book here, The Carrying. I saw her speak a couple years ago. I don't know if you were at that one, but
I was not.
She's an amazing poet, and every time I see or read poetry that is being celebrated like that, I always try to see what it is.
Right.
Not just read the poem and understand it, connect with it, whatever. I want to see what got it to that point.
Mm-hmm.
What I like to do is go back to their old stuff and just see how did they get from there to here, and it is, as you're saying, it gets condensed. Yeah. It's tighter.
Yeah. My son got his MFA in poetry. Well, he got his MFA in writing maybe a decade ago, and he'll probably be mad at me for saying it was that long ago. But,
that's all right.
But he, maybe it was 8 years ago. But I think he found that experience a great experience because he experimented extensively with form. Mm-hmm. And there, the craft has come up with a whole new set of ways of approaching language and the structure of the poem on the page. And so I know I'm not current on all of that, but I know what I like.
The poetry form is changing for sure, and I've seen Kazim Ali is another poet. I don't know if you were familiar with him, but when his book, the what is it? Something about Chandra Lee. I have it around here somewhere. But the poetry is, it's different line spacing and it's interesting format, and I'm like, oh, you can tell a story with just a line break,
right? Just the shape of the words
exactly
on the page.
So I've been kind of working on that with
and that's what my son taught me. Too.
Yeah.
And it's an evolving craft, which is good.
Languages has always been evolving. I that MIT project I did when I interviewed this linguist, he said, and I raised my hackles a bit, but he said that apostrophes weren't necessary as long as you had context. And I was like, but he was like, if you're getting upset by that, you shouldn't, because language is constantly evolving. It's always changing. So just
so true.
Get used to it. Yeah.
Very true.
It's scarily true sometimes. Along the way, I asked you a little bit ago about wanting to just step away from meetings or jobs or whatever to do writing. But along the way, have you ever had to talk yourself out of quitting something? So a comfortable thing that helps you pay bills or whatever, to get into something that will be a bit of a struggle. I know you had a family at the time you were writing these novels.
Yeah.
So, was that a big concern for you as well?
Oh yeah. So astrologically, I'm a Capricorn all the way down, which means I have this heightened sense of responsibility for everything in the world.
Right. Uh-huh.
and I have this great sense of obligation, and so I've been heavily motivated by needing to fulfill my duties as a dad and as a family member, and certainly as a provider along the way, or a contributor as a provider. And so has that factored into my decisions about how to spend my time with writing? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I used to really beat myself up about that until I grew up enough to realize that life is always a series of choices, and I think if you have the desire to write that is of that sort where you want to be the best in the world and it's the only thing you care about, then you should just do that. And you should radically commit surgery on your schedule, and you should not do anything that takes you away from the writing,
and be prepared for.
But that wasn't me. For me, I had a really strong desire to be a dad and a good dad and a present father, and I had a really strong desire to live a certain kind of life. So I used to wonder why I couldn't do it all, and it's because that's not how life works. Yeah.
What do you think? It seems like a larger mentality, and not just individuals, but a larger mentality that you have to sacrifice if you want to be a writer or anything like that. Why do you think this is, and what can be done to, I know we probably can't change it. I think it's always been like that historically, but what can we do to help it change or get better for writers?
Well, I think just talk about it and make it clear that that's not necessarily the case. So where I would begin with that is saying, we have it in our psyche that there's the tortured writer thing, right? So writers are people who drink too much, or creators, artists are people who drink too much and they have tortured souls and they destroy themselves at a young age. And have there been lots of creative folks, writers included, who have done that? Sure. And there have been, at the same time, inconvenient other examples of people who live long and beautiful lives while creating amazing work.
Right.
And but the enduring images, the stories that resonate with people, are the ones about pain.
The starving artist.
Yeah. So it's the starving artist and I think, what we have to get comfortable with is the idea. It's not the you can have it all story, but the counterpoint to the suffering, tortured artist is the artist who leads a balanced life. And they may have to work to at another thing in order to pay their bills, but they create, and they create things that give them satisfaction and maybe add to their portfolio of life's of resources and support. But I just think we have this idea that it has to be something awful when it doesn't.
No, it really doesn't. And there's for comedians, it's the tragedy plus time equals comedy kind of a thing, right.
I love that. I don't think I've heard that one.
You haven't heard that one. Yeah. And it's, so, I mean, I get that, that you have to experience, you can tell a better story with a lot of experience behind you, I think.
Right.
But, I hear these stories of people who published their first book at 25 and just has been writing for 30 years after that,
Right.
And I'm wondering, what are they, the lucky ones, or are they who we should be paying attention to and how they did it?
Well, and the thing I would say for you and me is that example isn't helpful for you and me, right?
Yeah,
I mean, because we're a little older than 25.
Point, yeah.
Just a tad. I've wondered this a lot because you asked me earlier, and I didn't go down this path, but my father had it in his mind, apparently from his teenage years, that he was going to be the best editorial cartoonist in the world. That was his drive. He wanted to be a political cartoonist. He wanted to draw the best cartoons, and he did it by about 25 or 26.
Oh, wow.
He won the Pulitzer Prize.
Jeez.
And after emigrating from Australia to the U.S. with my sister and me and my mom, and extraordinary. So he had that kind of clarity, and actually, it totally screwed me up.
Yeah,
because
why's that?
Well, because I two reasons. One was I sort of felt like that you had to do that. If you wanted to be creative, you had to be exceptional.
Yeah.
And so I developed the fiercest inner critic that you could possibly imagine, because nothing could measure up to to that. And so that was one thing, and the other was, and then he started enjoying the fruits of success and being celebrated and getting all kinds of attention, and then you think that's what writing is about, or being in the arts is about.
Yeah.
And most of the time, it's nothing about that.
No.
So, I do think we can learn from people who at a very young age are clear on what they want to do and pursue that. Or maybe it isn't about age. Maybe it's about clarity.
Yeah.
And for the rest of us who are rediscovering a passion later in life, or who have carried this passion like you have all your years, but every day is a new struggle around it and a new act of devotion. It doesn't have to be about getting it exactly right at 25, and it can be this long, beautiful dance through life. I'm convinced of that.
It can be. I know at this age, what I'm experiencing is fighting off the envy, jealousy
Yeah.
of, seeing so many people have a book release thing and all this. And I'm just like, I want that. But I'm also reminding myself that I'm getting closer. I'm not sitting around wondering why it's not happening. I'm actually doing the work. Right. But still, that's where I'm at now. And I try not to say I should have had multiple books by now. And I don't want to get to that point. I used to say that.
Right.
But I don't want to be in that mindset either.
Yeah, and I actually, I'm so glad that you have made that journey. So many people don't. And if you listen to what you just said, it internalizes, what you're fighting against is internalizing a definition of success that is about what you have had recognized out in the world by external sources. And if you're engaged in the act of creating and that gives you satisfaction, then that's in some ways its own reward. But then if you are slowly moving toward a goal of having that book out there, which we both aspire to,
sure,
right? And having some degree of recognition, it starts with the process that you're engaged in every day. I'd also add, I told this story at the Creative Morning session, but I think we define the relevance of work in such a narrow way, and it usually has to do with money. Of course we do, because it's part of what we are. It's part of how society measures everything anyway. But sometimes the value of the work we've done, we'll never know. I meeting you have no way of knowing the impact that it had on me in terms of helping me feel better as a writer whose writing is still in process. And that wasn't your intent, but it's an impact that you had in the world. I shared another story about an artist a singer whose words hit me at just the right moment to literally save my life in an extraordinary way. Not the songwriter's intention.
No, they couldn't know.
They were, they wanted to get the contract and but I just think what we have to accept is the process is the joy, and it has outcomes that we can't possibly appreciate.
I don't know if you've had a chance to sit down at a book festival, for example, and sell your book, or sit there where people can walk up and pick it up. But and I've talked about this before, one of my favorite things, even if I don't sell the book of poetry, which really it's not going to make me rich, but even if I don't, if they pick it up, read a few, nod a little bit, put it down and walk away, that almost feels like a sale. Because there was a connection. They read something that I put down on paper and they go, I feel that too. And that gives me a sense of fulfillment about the work I'm doing with writing. Mm-hmm. It may not be exactly an end goal, but it's a small goal that I have that makes me feel better about what I'm doing.
Yeah. I think that's profound. It is in some ways what we want. I think it's actually why, this is a digression, but I think it's often why writers can get sidetracked on doing writers' retreats because there is something that is deeply rewarding about reading your work and having people react to it in just that way. And that we undervalue that connection. We think, but that is that connection is actually what the whole work is about. It is about touching other people's lives and having a story resonate in ways maybe you don't even understand. So I love that. I love that image.
Well, and some people have said that the final collaboration as an artist even is with your audience, and that's great. So make it good, do the best
that's
you can.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. By the way, I don't want to suggest in any way, shape, or form that any of us doesn't care about success or shouldn't care about success as measured by having broader recognition and being paid for the work. That is a beautiful thing, and anybody who writes aspires to it in some way.
I used to not want to sell out. That's what I was like. I'm going to sell out if I sell my stuff, and now I'm like, yes, I'm buy my books, buy all of them.
Yeah, exactly.
So
it's good to be paid for your work.
Of course it is, because if it's something that you are passionate about, you feel good about. I don't know, but how often do a lot of people get to say, man, I'm really passionate about this work and I love this.
Right.
I get to do that.
Yeah.
2/3 of my day, I get to do that, and like today I was sitting at Harland and I had the choice of working on the Conrad Prebys episode or my writing. And it was just like, oh, darn, this is great. These are my choices.
Yeah.
And,
but you created that. You constructed that.
Yeah, and there were many years that I'm sure a lot of other writers and yourself have gone through where you didn't have any of it, and you were just sitting there writing, and you're like, I hope this pays off someday, in whatever way.
Right.
There's a lot of times where we're just hoping.
Yeah.
But
exactly.
We if we can look back on it, I when I applied for I applied for the Far South Border North grant a couple years ago, and I remember I had to write down a list of all of the community events or how I'm involved in the community. And I was like, oh, this is going to be a little bit of a task. And I started writing down this list, and it just kept going. And I'm like, wow, I'm actually having a pretty good time over here. Like I'm doing a lot of things, like a lot more than I used to. And 15 years ago, I was deeply depressed, and like I'm not doing what I want to do. And now I can go, I'm actually kind of doing what I wanted to do. Yeah. And there's something so nice about that, like we can say rewarding, but it's just nice.
We've got this at the foundation. We've got this whole program going now called Healing Through Arts and Nature.
Yeah, I've heard about this.
And it's so interesting. The premise is that instead of underwriting clinical treatment for kids with anxiety, young people with anxiety and depression, or other mental health issues, which we can never fund enough of, and the demand for which is sort of off the charts, we've started funding programs that reconnect them and communities with opportunities to engage in the arts and engage with nature. And it has a remarkable impact on how people see the world. When they're expressing themselves through art, they feel a sense of agency and they feel a connection that they would otherwise miss. Similarly with being out in nature. And I think what you just described about your opportunity to create, you have to acknowledge yourself in that, because you did create that. You structured your life that way. But of course you feel that way, because now you have filled your days with the creativity that makes you happy.
Yeah. Didn't we speak with Chris Appleton recently?
Yes. Yeah. Chris was actually, so he heads an organization that does this in the health space, and he actually leads an effort to have doctors and health systems prescribe arts events.
I love that.
To help people deal with mental health challenges. And he's got the goods. He's got data that shows to insurers that it is helpful and as good an intervention in some cases as medication.
I would love to see and share that data with everybody, because I am trying to convince.
He heads an organization called Art Pharmacy.
Art Pharmacy. It's in Atlanta.
Actually, I think that's a good question. I know they do this work in Massachusetts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what okay.
And they're looking at San Diego.
I love the idea that that art is a medicine.
Yeah.
And it has cured me of some things, like just heartache. If we just go right there, whether it's music or writing poetry or whatever it may be, it just made me feel better. I was able to process it through the writing or the listening of the song, and I could go, all right, well, now I understand it a little more.
Exactly.
And that when I was just this past weekend up in San Luis Obispo, and we went hiking up near Big Sur, and just being outside was just like,
magical, right?
It is. Yeah. It is. It does so much for my energy, and I just came home so refreshed, like ready to dive into things. So we need more of that.
We do. We do.
We talk a lot on here, and we talked a little before we started recording about individual storytellers. But what I think working on this podcast we've seen is there's community storytellers, and you even told some community-wide stories about Detroit and Pittsburgh at the Creative Mornings thing. So I'm curious what kind of impact community-wide stories can have on people.
I mean, this for me is the big convergence of these two parts of my life. That, my love of storytelling as a writer, and or aspiring writer. No,
You're a writer.
I know. I keep wrestling with this terminology.
Okay.
But my my love of storytelling as a writer, and then my absolute conviction that communities and societies have stories too. I mean, we're living this on the national scene at the moment. The stories we tell ourselves change and evolve over time. And I am absolutely convinced that when communities like ours tell themselves negative stories about what is possible, then we get lesser results. And when we tell ourselves better stories about what is possible, we get inspiring outcomes in the community, and that begins to feed a better narrative cycle. And I know, like, I'll tell you what I saw when I came into San Diego. An amazing town. There's so much dynamism, entrepreneurism, innovation, optimism. I mean, it's incredible. There's also a weird defeatism, where this is the second largest city in California. People don't even talk about it that way here.
I just found that out recently, and I've been here for 17 years.
Right. Well,
I was like, it's got to be the third, maybe the fourth. But no,
it's not part of the narrative. And there's a story based on sports and sports teams that. I won't name any of them. I'm tempted to, but
we don't need to speak those names.
No, but we, there's just this sense of maybe we're not as competitive as other places, and lots of towns tell themselves stories like that. I identified with it immediately because that was the narrative so much that I encountered when I was in Pittsburgh. So. Changing that narrative is the thing that if I could make any one single contribution beyond any project or initiative we might do, it's that we attack that psychology and tell better stories.
Yeah, and I think Pittsburgh, as you discussed in the Creative Mornings talk, Pittsburgh is proof that when you tell these stories, things can get better.
Yeah, well, in that town there was a story about the riverfronts in that town, city of three rivers, but nobody went near the riverfront, and they were told as kids not to go near the water. It was dangerous. It was dirty. It was a bad place. We started telling a different story while I was there about the waterfront as the centerpiece of community life, and a vision developed for how that might be translated into reality, and it turned into a 16-mile continuous loop park around the center of the rivers in the center of the city, which then began to drive a new look at development and a different type of quality than anybody had imagined. So, you absolutely can tell a different story and change the outcome of a city by telling a better story about what's possible there. It is not always easy. When the person who really first taught me this was working with Teresa Hines Carey, who headed the Hines Endowments when I first encountered them. And her, I remember when I went to work for her, one of her first big ideas was to lead a revolution in thinking around green design and green building. And she started telling people in Pittsburgh, we're going to be a leader in green design and green building. And those of us who were the shock troops out front trying to sell that vision, what we would encounter is, what?
Yeah. What is that? Yeah.
And, this is a Rust Belt city. It's a steel city. But by God, 15 years later, it happened. And, stories take a while to take root, and they have to feel somewhat authentic. So you have to wrap it around the old stories.
And you have to sort of accept that it's going to be a long game kind of a thing. I read this article in Voice of San Diego, maybe, I'm going to say within 5 to 10 years ago. It could have been 10, it could have been a little longer, but I don't think it was. And somebody, it was an artist who was complaining about the cost of living for artists here in San Diego and was talking about moving. And that really upset me, because you can't make a change by leaving. You're just not going to do it.
Right.
So I understand it's hard. I know it's difficult. And maybe there are other mitigating factors that I'm not thinking of, but like still stick around,
right?
Have that sort of impact.
Yeah.
Join the community story, and try to be a part of making that scene better.
It's one of the reasons that I think artists are so important. Artists and writers and poets, or artists of all kinds, are so important to the life of a city. And please don't leave. Please stay and be part of the narrative, because change happens in a community most often initially through its artists and the things that they do and that they make possible. They just bring a different energy to a place. They bring a different sense of what's possible to a place. It's a really important defining element of a community.
And I think when it brings with a wide amount of voices, it brings different cultures, and with that comes empathy and understanding of others. And that, I think, helps everything else.
Well, it's hugely important right now too. I mean, if you look in our culture, if you look at what's going on in national politics, there really are two basic competing stories out there, and one is a story of who doesn't belong, and one is a story of who does belong. I think artists tend to tell the story of who does belong and who's welcome and what is possible, rather than the other story. And I think but I think artists also help bridge those two different worldviews. It's artists can see things in that other story that maybe a journalist can't, or an average citizen won't think about, and certainly a partisan ideologue won't think about. It's that, how do we get deeper to our shared humanity question? And I think artists are exceptionally good at that.
Well, I think artists are really tapped into that sort of human thinking and behavior and emotion, especially, and I'm not saying others aren't, non-artists aren't, but I think artists, they make art through emotion. Most of the time, at least good art. But
my mother is an exceptionally gifted writer. She spent most of her career as a Jungian marriage and family therapist.
Oh, wow.
So she did a lot of work on our common iconography in society, and understanding why people do the things that they do, and the role of mythology in how we understand each other. But then as she retired from that, she decided to write a memoir, which led to a second memoir. And what I've seen from her is she's not worried. She's not really worried at this stage of her life about who buys the book.
Yeah.
But she is really deeply invested in telling a story that's meaningful to her. And it turns out that has a lot of currency with a lot of other folks who she would never have imagined reaching. So her first book was about her being a child in Nazi-occupied Amsterdam, and her mother being in the Dutch resistance and their experience nearly being killed a few times. And that was, it just became a connection with a surprising array of people around the world. And she's just about to come out with her second installment, which is about her years as a young as a teenager and early 20s in Australia, which was a formative phase of her life. And again, different audience, but she's already connecting with people who she never would have really thought it was possible to reach.
Well, even just that sort of story, people are like, oh, I want to read that. Like, I can't connect with it on a personal level. I didn't live that life, but that's a fascinating story, And...
Well, and this is, you and I have talked about this before, but this is one of the things we forget about writing, which is, I am getting better at this because it's hard for me.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to tell stories on myself, or to be personally revealing and vulnerable, right?
You should write poetry.
It is right, but when we do that, people see themselves in those stories if they're well told, and they're because so much of human experience is universal.
Yeah,
and we imagine, oh, this is just my story. No one else will care. Well, oftentimes it turns out that they do because they see themselves in it.
Yeah. I think I've read a lot of characters that I see myself in. Lately, I mean like the last 10 or 20 years at least, I've found myself looking for characters that are nothing like me. And I just enjoy reading of these things and environments and places that I didn't even know about or knew existed. James Baldwin. I can't identify with the characters or the stories, but it almost feels, or maybe probably was, real life.
Right.
And you're just like, oh, that I can connect with, that hardship or struggle or whatever. I understand that part.
Yeah.
And I seek out finding a connection with people that I just am not like.
Yeah, which is, again, part of the genius of writing. I think
it helps.
I think it helps us see life circumstances that we otherwise wouldn't have seen, and we can appreciate what other people are going through that we otherwise wouldn't have seen.
Helps us create.
It's an extraordinary window in the world.
Yeah, and it helps us create very interesting characters.
Yeah.
In our book. So.
And I actually think, on the fiction front, it is important for writers to do their homework, obviously, but being able to explore with all kinds of characters is part of the fiction journey.
Yeah.
And there's a dictum in writing which I realized at a certain point is both liberating and limiting around write what you know. And that's great advice in that there should always be a level of personal authenticity in what you're sharing. On the other hand, we only have a tiny, tiny, tiny slice of the experience of the world, and part of what fiction allows us to do is see more broadly, and I think that includes writers.
I have like 14 million more questions.
I wrote my Ring of Years book was about the central character was the protagonist was a woman. Okay. That was a step outside my knowledge set, right? I had to, but it was great fun for me to imagine what life must be like, if this were happening to somebody like her. And I wrote a completely different book than I would have if it had been a guy.
Male character, yeah. I like including characters that you really have to think more about. You go, oh, would that sound like, someone who would say that? Kind of a thing.
Yeah.
I that's a challenge. And there are some writers who are damn good at it too.
Yeah.
Matt Haig,
phenomenal. Phenomenal writer.
The Midnight Library, the main character.
It's one of my favorite books.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah.
It's gorgeous, So but he writes. That was a female character in that book, and it was just like, how did he get into the mind of someone that was not like him? And it's just, he listens, he reads, he experiences other things, and he's able to put that all together and create this single character. I hope I can get to that point someday. I
you
try
and
to,
me both.
Yeah, I try to include characters that are different, but
that's the aspiring part.
It is. Yeah, it is. All right, last question, and this is one I ask a lot of people. So, if there was one book or movie or song or anything creative you wish you wrote, what would it be?
Oh, wow. You took the Midnight Library.
Yeah.
So
you can say it if you want. Yeah.
Well, it actually, I became a huge fan of his from reading that book, and it did strike me as, damn, I wish I wrote that book.
Yeah.
I'm so, what's usually on top of mind for me is things I've recently read. So I just recently read the Magician series trilogy by Lev Grossman.
Oh, I've seen the name.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I kind of wish I'd written those.
Yeah. What was it about them?
It's a sort of much more down to earth take on everyday but magical magicians than let's say Harry Potter. But it feels so grounded in what it's like to be, for example, a teenager, or and to be a screw up, and to have a gift that you abuse for years and years.
Right.
And I loved that, his willingness to experiment and really sit in the discomfort of a character for a long time. So I would say that one. When Harry Potter came out, I read every one of those books to my kids at night, and I wished every single time, why didn't I write this book? There are a whole lot of reasons why.
Sure.
I know. Yeah. So the list is long, but what I'm trying to do instead of being jealous is be inspired.
Right. Right. Do you find yourself sort of tapping into how they do it when you're writing your own stuff? Do you, not to steal a voice, but do you use how they're phrasing things in a way, or do you just try to learn from it? And
that's I love that question. And I am sure I am unconsciously influenced by a lot of folks, and sometimes consciously aware that I'm being influenced by someone. But when I have consciously tried to leverage somebody else's techniques, it hasn't worked for me.
Okay.
One of the things that I struggled with in Ring of Years is I had been doing a lot of fiction reading, literary fiction, and I was influenced by a writer, I'm embarrassed to say whose name I'm blanking on right now, but I there were moments in that book where I consciously wanted to translate that technique into this thriller genre that I was working with, and it actually was one of the weak points of the book.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Not because he wasn't a master and it was a bad technique. It was not my technique, and I hadn't mastered it or internalized it. So I don't know. I think it doesn't work for me.
Yeah. So I think it's fine to practice with those things, but especially because they help. I think they help you determine your voice. You say, "Oh, that didn't work. That's not me. That didn't feel right."
Right.
Whether it didn't sound right is different, but that just didn't feel right.
Exactly.
When I wrote it.
Yeah.
So I remember I was taking a college course at Iowa State University, and one of the assignments was to write a poem using the exact voice of someone else, not to steal it, but just write a poem using that voice and see how that felt. And see what that did for your own writing. And it was one of the best things I'd ever done.
Because it doesn't feel good.
It doesn't feel good, right? It's like it is literally a circle in a square peg,
right?
Or a square hole. It didn't feel like me, But through that, I was like, okay, well now I know that doesn't work. Let's try other things and find my voice. It wasn't until I moved to San Diego and started performing that I actually found my poetry voice.
Oh, interesting.
But it took me getting through that and actually taking it seriously.
In the act of performing.
And getting out there and just seeing how others were performing or writing or not performing. Yeah. And so I doing, it's part of the reason I asked this question is doing what others are doing, is that helping you? Are you or reading what others are doing, is that helping you? Like how do we shape our voices, kind of a thing?
Yeah, when I was so both times that I've sat down to write a novel, I found reading to be very bad for my writing.
Yeah.
I just got distracted. One of two things would happen. I'd feel so intimidated by the quality of someone else's writing that I just decide I wasn't.
This is crap.
Yeah,
I'm not writing
this is crap.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get rid of this.
Yeah.
Or I'd want to go that way, put that into my, and then I'd forget what the thread of my story was and I know I can't do that because that's not my story.
Yeah.
And so it was just I found it to be a distraction and not helpful for me. I know lots of writers who aren't bothered by reading as they're writing.
I can't do it.
Yeah.
If I'm writing poetry, I can read fiction. That's fine.
Yeah.
But if I'm actually working on my short stories, I put all books aside.
It's smart. I think that's what you've got to do.
Yeah, yeah. But as you said, there are some writers who can read, and there are people that will read 2 books at the same time. I can't even do that.
That I can do.
That you can do? Oh, I can't do it. I don't know how people do it. I can't split my brain like that. Actually,
no, I remember it was Don DeLillo whose work I was influenced by as I was writing Ring of Years, and I the thing that I was influenced by, because he's such a gifted writer, but the thing I was influenced by was he plays around with just jumping around in time and space, and I thought that was a cool technique, and I played with that in my story. I just wasn't as good at it.
Yeah, do you think you could?
And it wasn't a genre that it worked as well.
Okay,
with,
Is that something you think you could have gotten better at with time, or is that just
if I'd stayed with that?
Stayed with it?
Yeah.
Do you think there are things?
But there are some techniques we're just either we're not good at, or they're just not meant to be ours.
That's what I was about to ask. Yeah. Are there things that we just they're just not going to work ever?
Yeah, I think that's true.
That's true.
I believe that's true.
Well, I'm never going to dunk a basketball.
Right.
So
I mean, unless you're a total polymath and can do everything well and
annoying, you mean?
Right. Right.
I knew a guy back when I was a teenager who could pick up any music instrument and just immediately know how to do it.
Amazing.
And I was angry, but I was like,
that is so cool.
Yeah, I was like, I don't want to be like that. I'll never be that. But that was pretty cool. So, well, Grant, I'm glad we did this.
I am really glad we did this, and I really do mean it, Adam. That I am grateful to you for just helping me in my journey coming back to thinking of myself as a writer, which is part of the journey of being a writer.
Yeah.
And I admire the way in which you integrate your creativity into your life. So,
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'm trying. I didn't do it a lot before. if you knew my past, you'd realize now that's why I'm doing it. So,
that's the blessing of a long life.
It is. And I hope it goes longer for the both of us.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah. Thanks, Grant. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.